On the morning of November 23, 1991, the Bryansk bus station smelled of diesel fuel and wet snow. 5 friends stood at the platform, shifting from foot to foot. Andrei Volkov held an envelope with money in his hands. 1,500 rubles. A fortune in those days. Tickets for the Spartak Dynamo Kiev match were not cheap, but they had been saving up for 3 months. Igor Somov adjusted his backpack and glanced at his watch. It was 10 in the morning. In 6 hours, they would be in Moscow, and in another 2 at Luzhniki Stadium. A fan's dream was about to come true. Listen, what if they lose? Smiled Denis Krasnov, the youngest of the group. Andrei slapped him on the shoulder. Then we wasted our money, but they'll win today. Before we start the story, write where you are from. We are very interested to know where you are watching our video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. A Liaz 677 bus with the number B247 EK32 pulled up to the platform. It was blue with a white stripe. The driver, Semyon Karpovich Dubin, a 52-year-old man with a receding hairline, opened the doors. The conductor, Maria Ivanovna Sklayarova, checked the tickets. No one knew what happened next. The bus arrived safely at Shelkovsky Station at 4:20 p.m., as scheduled. 33 passengers got off and went about their business. But 5 young people were missing from the bus. It was as if they had been swallowed up by the earth. The driver, Dubin, did not notice the missing passengers right away. It was only when he conducted his usual post-trip inspection of the bus that he realized someone was missing. The noisy group in sports jackets had disappeared. Dubin scratched the back of his head and shrugged. Young people will be young people. They probably got off in Tula to go for a walk. But in the evening, the phone in Nina Georgievna Somova's apartment was ringing off the hook. Svetlana, Igor's fiancée, had come to meet him at the bus station. The train arrived, but the groom was nowhere to be found. His mother clutched her heart. Igor was never late. He never disappeared without warning. By 11 o'clock in the evening, the worried parents of 3 of the 5 young men gathered at the police station. The sergeant on duty, Peter Kolosov, sighed wearily. It was Friday. The weekend was just around the corner, and here he was with worried parents. But when he realized the seriousness of the situation, he immediately passed the case on to his superiors. On the morning of November 24th, senior investigator Vladislav Nikolaevich Rogozin of the Regional Prosecutor's Office took charge of the investigation. 15 years in law enforcement had taught him to distinguish between ordinary youthful mischief and real trouble. And this smelled like big trouble. Rogozin summoned the driver Dubin for questioning. The man was nervous, smoking one cigarette after another, his hands shaking. He spoke incoherently. I remember them, of course I remember. 5 guys, football fans. They got on in Bryansk and showed their tickets, and then, I don't know when they got off. How can you not know? The investigator asked in surprise. You're supposed to monitor who gets on and off the bus. Dubin lit another cigarette. There are a lot of people at every stop. Some get on, some get off. You can't keep track of everyone. Conductor Sklyarova confirmed the driver's words. But she didn't remember much either. Either they got off in Orel or in Tula, or maybe they got off in Moscow and slipped unnoticed into the crowd. Rogozin sent inquiries to all the cities along the route. They checked hospitals, morgues, and sobering up stations. They questioned the duty controllers at bus stations. The result was 0. The 5 young people had vanished into thin air. Meanwhile, their parents were not sitting idly by. Nina Georgievna Somova organized a search party. Every weekend, they followed the bus route, searched the woods along the road, put up posters, and questioned local residents. Igor's mother did not sleep at night, walking hundreds of kilometers, but her son had disappeared without a trace. The first serious clue appeared 2 weeks later. Truck driver Vasily Kornev contacted the police after seeing a report on television. He clearly remembered November 23rd. He had overtaken the Bryansk-Moscow bus around noon near the village of Droskovo in the Kaluga region. The bus suddenly turned off the highway onto a dirt road. Kornev said, "I thought it had broken down. But 5 kilometers later, I saw it again on the road. It seemed strange at the time." This information radically changed the case. So the bus had indeed made an unscheduled stop. But why? And why did the driver hide this fact? Rogozin and a group of employees drove to the Kaluga region. They questioned residents of the village of Droskovo and combed the surrounding forests. They found the dirt road where the bus had allegedly turned off. The road led to an old quarry, abandoned in the 1970s. Dog handlers with service dogs were working at the site. They searched for traces, items of clothing, anything. But too much time had passed. The November rains and December snow had washed away all the evidence. Rogozin called Dubin's driver again. This time, the man was even more nervous. He was sweating, even though the office was cool, and he kept fidgeting with the edges of his jacket. "Semyon Karpovich, we have a witness. He saw your bus turn off the highway." Dubin turned pale. "That can't be. I remember the route clearly. There were no stops." "Then explain Kornev's testimony." "I don't know. Maybe he was mistaken, or he saw another bus." But the investigators sensed that the driver was lying. Every fiber of his experienced detective's being told him that this man knew more than he was saying. But there was no evidence. The case was taking on an increasingly grim complexion. The disappearance of 5 people at the same time could not be a coincidence. Someone had taken them. But who and why? Theories multiplied. Maybe the guys got involved with criminals, tried to make money reselling tickets, or did they witness something they shouldn't have? Rogozin studied the biographies of each of the missing men. Igor Somov was a model employee, preparing for his wedding and saving money for an apartment. Andrei Volkov had served in the army without complaint, worked as a lathe operator, and was respected by his colleagues. The other 3 also had no problems with the law, ordinary Soviet guys. They worked, dated girls, and loved soccer. What could have attracted criminal attention to them? The investigation reached a dead end by the end of December. Every lead turned out to be another disappointment. Every piece of evidence failed to stand up to scrutiny. Time was passing, and the chances of finding the boys alive were dwindling before our eyes. Nina Georgievna did not give up. She visited psychics, hired private investigators, and wrote letters to newspapers. A mother's heart refused to accept the thought of her son's death. Somewhere inside, hope lingered. Igor was alive. He would definitely return. The year 1992 brought new disappointments. Rogozin expanded the search area and enlisted the help of colleagues from neighboring regions. They checked all possible places where the missing men could have been. The result was the same: no trace of them. Driver Dubin remained steadfast. During repeated interrogations, he did not change his testimony one iota. Either he really knew nothing, or he was a tough nut to crack. Rogozin leaned toward the latter, but without evidence, he was powerless. By the summer of 1993, the case had effectively been shelved. Officially, The investigation continued, but no active measures were taken. Rogozin was assigned new cases that required urgent attention. His missing friends remained only in a folder of documents and in the hearts of their grief-stricken parents. Years passed. The Soviet Union collapsed, and a new life began. But for the families of the missing, time stopped on November 23, 1918. Every ring at the door made their hearts beat faster. What if it was them? What if they had returned? Nina Georgievna aged 10 years in the first 2 years of searching. Her hair turned gray, her eyes were tired, and her hands were worn out from work and endless trips to hospitals and morgues. But she did not give up. She organized an association of parents of missing children and helped other families who had fallen into similar misfortune. In 1995, the case was officially suspended. The statute of limitations had not yet expired, but there was little hope left. Rogozin retired, handing over the case to a younger colleague. The new investigator studied the documents and threw up his hands. There were no leads, no witnesses, no evidence. But life had an unexpected twist in store. In 2005, driver Semyon Dubin died of a heart attack. His widow, Raisa Karpovna, was sorting through his belongings in preparation for a move. In the pocket of an old jacket, she found a note written in shaky handwriting. "Forgive me, I didn't want to. They made me. The money is in bank account number 15847. The woman took the note to the police. 12,000 rubles were found in the specified savings bank account. This was a huge amount of money in the early 1990s. Where did a simple driver get such a sum? The case got a second wind. Lieutenant Colonel Alexei Morozov, an investigator for particularly important cases, took over the investigation. His fresh perspective allowed him to notice details that his colleagues had overlooked. Morozov studied the criminal situation in the region in the early 1990s. Gangland killings, road robberies, and disappearances were commonplace at the time. Perhaps the 5 friends had fallen victim to organized crime. The investigator established that between 1991 and 1993, 8 more people disappeared on the stretch of road between Tula and Moscow. All at different times, all under strange circumstances. Was it the work of an entire gang? But the main breakthrough would not come for another 12 years. On December 2, 2017, the nurse on duty at Psychiatric Hospital No. 4 in Kaluga was making her rounds before her shift. In the isolation ward lay a man who had been found in the forest 3 days earlier. He had no documents and was in a state of deep confusion. He did not answer questions and showed almost no reaction to external stimuli. But that morning, he spoke. Bus stopped. We got out to smoke." The nurse froze. Was the patient delirious, or was he trying to say something? She approached him, but the man fell silent again, staring at the ceiling with a vacant look. An hour later, the results of the fingerprint analysis came back. The 46-year-old man had been listed as missing since November 23, 1991. His name was Igor Somov. One of 5 friends had returned after 26 years. But who had he become during those years? And what had happened to the others? Part 2. Investigation. Psychiatrist Anna Sergeyevna Volkova had been working with patients who had survived extreme situations for 20 years. But Igor Somov's case shocked even her. The man looked 60 years old, but his biological age was 46. He had gray hair, deep wrinkles, and hands covered with scars from hard labor. His physical condition was also depressing. He was vitamin deficient, had joint problems, and showed signs of multiple fractures. It was as if he had spent a quarter of a century in conditions that could hardly be called human. But the main mystery lay in his psyche. Igor remembered his childhood, his youth, the day he disappeared. And then, nothing. 26 years of his life had been erased from his memory, as if they had never existed. Volkova began her work with cautious therapeutic sessions. Gradually, piece by piece, she reconstructed the shattered picture of the past. It was a long and painful process. The first thing they did was call Nina Georgievna Somova. The 78-year-old woman didn't believe it at first. How many times over the years had she received calls with false hopes? How many times had her heart been broken by yet another disappointment? But when she saw her son, she had no doubts. Igor had changed beyond recognition. But a mother's heart is never wrong. The same eyes, the same moles on his hand, the same scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fight. His mother cried, hugged her found son, and whispered his name. Igor looked at her in amazement, as if trying to remember something important. His memory returned slowly, but it returned. Investigator Morozov joined the case. He understood that Igor's return could be the key to solving a 26-year-old mystery. But there was no time to rush. Careless interference could completely destroy his already fragile psyche. Igor gave his first coherent testimony only in February 2018. His memory was returning in fragments, like a broken mosaic. First, there were separate images, then whole episodes. The bus did indeed turn off the highway on November 23, 1991. The driver, Dubin, explained to the passengers that he needed to make a technical stop to check the engine and add oil. It was nothing unusual, and no one was surprised. 5 friends got out to stretch their legs and smoke. The forest around them seemed deserted and peaceful. The first snowflakes danced in the air, and fallen leaves crunched underfoot. It was a typical November day. Andrei said it wouldn't be long. Igor recalled, 10 minutes, and we'll be on our way. We weren't worried. There was still plenty of time before the game. But 3 men in camouflage clothing emerged from the forest. They were armed with hunting rifles. Their faces were hidden under balaclavas, but from their voices, they sounded young, around 30 or 40 years old. Andrei was the first to realize the danger. He shouted to his friends to run and rush toward the road. But there was nowhere to run. The bus was already turning around, ready to leave. The driver had received his payment for the service and was in a hurry to get rid of the witnesses. One of the attackers fired a shot into the air. The shot whistled over their heads, causing everyone to freeze. Resistance was useless. 3 against 5, but the 3 had weapons and a clear advantage. The boys were tied up, blindfolded, and loaded into the back of a truck. Igor remembered the smell of diesel fuel, the rough hands pushing him in the back, and the horror of realizing what was happening. A fun trip to a football game had turned into a nightmare. They drove for about an hour along forest roads. The truck bounced over bumps, their hands went numb, and their mouths were dry with fear. Dennis cried quietly, Oleg prayed, and Mikhail tried to free himself from the ropes. The truck stopped near some kind of building. From the sounds, Igor realized they were being led underground. Metal doors, concrete steps, echoes in long corridors, an underground bunker left over from the war. Investigator Morozov listened to the testimony and felt his hair stand on end. If Igor was telling the truth, then his friends had fallen into the hands of professional criminals. Well organized, with a hideout, connections, and resources. Based on Igor's description, experts began searching for the underground facility. After the war, many military bases, command posts, and warehouses were built in the Kaluga region. Many were abandoned in the 1990s and could serve as the perfect hideout for a gang. Psychiatrist Volkova continued working with her patient. Each session brought new details. Igor recalled the layout of the bunker, the voices of the criminals, and snippets of their conversations. The leader was called Kostya. He was a man of about 40, with an army bearing and a distinctive scar on his right cheek. He spoke with a slight southern accent, swore profusely, but never raised his voice. He was cold, calculating, and cruel. He had two henchmen, Gina and Boris. The first was short and stocky with gold teeth. The second was tall and thin with a nervous tic. He constantly twitched his right eye. But the most frightening memories were of the fate of his friends. Igor found it difficult to talk about what happened in the bunker. His voice broke, his hands shook, and sweat beaded on his forehead. Andrei Volkov tried to escape in 1993. He dug a hole in the wall of his cell and got out. But he didn't get far. Kostya found him 2 days later, beat him half to death, and shot him in front of the others. The lesson for everyone else was not to try to escape. Denis Krasnov fell ill in 1998. It started with a cold, which turned into pneumonia. There were no proper medicines, doctors, or conditions for treatment in the bunker. The young man was dying for 2 weeks, and the criminals did not even try to help him. Mikhail Petrov died in 2003 when part of the bunker collapsed. The old concrete structures could not withstand the load, and the ceiling collapsed. Mikhail was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was simply buried under the rubble. Oleg Zuev held out the longest. He died of a heart attack in 2011. His heart couldn't withstand the constant stress, poor nutrition, and lack of medical care. By that time, Igor was the only survivor. Each death was a blow to him. His childhood friends, with whom he had dreamed of soccer and a bright future, were dying one after another, and he continued to live, working for criminals, losing hope of liberation. Morozov carefully recorded every detail. Gradually, a picture of a crime of monstrous proportions emerged. It was not just kidnapping, but the creation of an underground labor force. Modern slavery in the truest sense of the word. According to Igor's testimony, counterfeit alcohol was produced in the bunker. Moonshine, fake vodka of well-known brands, and alcohol for resale. It was a lucrative business in the 1990s, when there was virtually no state control. The captives were used as labor. They carried sacks of sugar, monitored the distillation equipment, and bottled the finished product. 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no days off or vacations. They were fed poorly: porridge, bread, sometimes stew. They were given just enough water to survive. Their clothes were old overalls and trousers that they did not change for years. They slept in cells measuring 2 by 3 meters. The beds were made of planks, with a thin mattress and a blanket. It was cold in winter and stuffy in summer. The ventilation was poor, and the smell was accordingly. But the worst thing was complete isolation from the outside world. No news, no letters, no contact with relatives, just work, sleep, and waiting for death. Many lost their minds from such a life. Igor survived thanks to his iron will and memories of his mother. Every day he imagined how he would return home, hug Nina Georgievna, and tell her about the nightmare he had endured. This dream kept him going during the most difficult moments. In 2016, the gang leader Kostya died of a stroke. Without a leader, the group began to fall apart. Gina and Boris could not agree among themselves, quarrels began, and production came to a standstill. In the fall of 2017, they decided to get rid of the last witness. Igor was taken to the forest and left to die. They expected that an emaciated man would not survive more than a day without food or water. But Igor proved to be more resilient than the criminals had thought. He wandered through the forest for 3 days, feeding on berries and roots and drinking water from puddles. On the 4th day, he was found by mushroom pickers and taken to the hospital. Morozov had enough information to begin an active search. Based on Igor's description, experts determined the approximate location of the bunker. It was an old military facility 15 kilometers from the village of Droskovo. The task force arrived at the site in March 2018. It was an abandoned area overgrown with bushes and young trees. Traces of the former military town were barely visible under a layer of fallen leaves. But most importantly, they found the entrance to the underground. A heavy metal door, half hidden by fallen trees. Behind it was a staircase leading into the bowels of the earth. It was exactly the place Igor had described. Inside the bunker, forensic experts found irrefutable evidence: equipment for producing alcohol, living quarters, and the personal belongings of the missing men. Andrei's watch with his initials engraved on it, Mikhail's camera, Oleg's guitar strings. 4 graves were found on the premises. Forensic examination confirmed that they contained the remains of Andrei Volkov, Denis Krasnov, Mikhail Petrov, and Oleg Zuev. All 4 had died exactly as Igor had described. Now all that remained was to find the killers. Photo fits were compiled based on the testimony of the sole surviving witness. Kostya, Gina, and Boris were the 3 men who turned the lives of 5 friends into hell. Kostya was already dead, but his accomplices could be hiding anywhere. Morozov put them on the federal wanted list and sent out alerts to all regions of the country. Gennady Lukin was the first to be found. A short, stocky man of 61 with gold teeth. He worked as a security guard at a warehouse in Tula. He lived quietly, keeping to himself, believing that his past crimes were buried forever. But the identification went smoothly. Igor immediately recognized his tormentor, despite the passing years. The same voice, the same mannerisms, the same gold teeth that glinted in the spotlight in the bunker. Lukin initially denied any involvement in the crime. He insisted that he was being mistaken for someone else, that he was an honest man and had never killed anyone. But when he was shown the evidence, he broke down. Boris Shevchuk turned himself in. Upon learning of his accomplice's arrest, he realized that the game was over. He surrendered to the police in Kaluga, fully admitted his guilt, and was ready to give detailed testimony. The 55-year-old man had aged and become emaciated. His nervous tic had intensified, and his right eye twitched every few seconds. It was clear that the years of fear of retribution had not been in vain. All 3, Kostin, Lukin, and Shevchuk, had been connected since Soviet times. They served in the same unit and remained friends after demobilization. In the early 1990s, they decided to earn money through crime. The scheme was simple and effective. Kostin worked in a car fleet and had connections with long-distance drivers. For a fee, they would inform him about wealthy passengers. Dubin received 500 rubles for information about 5 friends with large sums of money. Another 1,000 rubles for agreeing to divert from the route at the right place. That was very good money at the time. The criminals took the money from their victims and took them to a bunker. Initially, they planned to hold them for a short time and then let them go. But they realized that they couldn't leave any witnesses alive. Thus began a story that would last 26 years. 5 friends became prisoners, slaves, victims of human greed and cruelty. 4 died in captivity, 1 survived and returned to tell the truth. But the main question remained. Why? Why keep people in captivity for a quarter of a century? Why turn them into slaves? Why set up an underground factory in a military bunker? Why did he do it? The truth turned out to be even more terrifying. Part 3. Truth and Retribution. Investigator Morozov sat opposite Boris Shevchuk in the interrogation room. The man smoked nervously, his right eye twitching twice as fast as normal. He had been hiding from justice for 27 years, and now his time had come. "Tell me from the beginning," Morozov said calmly. "How it all started." Shevchuk took a deep breath and slowly began to speak. "Kostya offered me easy money. The 90s were tough times, you know. Factories were closing, salaries weren't being paid for months, and here was an opportunity to earn more than a year's salary in one go." Vyacheslav Kostin was indeed the mastermind behind the operation. A former sergeant in the engineering troops, after the army he worked as a mechanic in a motor depot. He had connections among the drivers, knew the schedules, routes, and peculiarities of the roads. The idea came by chance. In October 1991, Kostin overheard a conversation between a driver and a conductor about passengers with a large sum of money. The businessmen were traveling to Moscow to buy goods for resale. One of them had 15,000 rubles in his pocket. Kostin offered the driver a share of the money and a small favor in return for the information. He wanted him to take a detour and make a technical stop in a deserted place. Then it would be easy to take the money from the rich men and let them go on their way. But the first operation did not go according to plan. The businessmen were not as compliant as expected. One tried to resist, was hit on the head with a rifle butt, and died on the spot. The second had to be killed so as not to leave any witnesses. Kostin realized that simply robbing them and letting them go would not work. It was too risky. They had to either kill them immediately or find another way to neutralize the witnesses. Then he remembered an abandoned military facility. It was a secret command post built during the Cold War. After 1991, the military left, leaving behind a fully equipped underground complex. Kostya was smart, Shevchuk continued. He understood that simple robbery wouldn't bring in much money, but if he created a permanent enterprise? The second plan was ingenious in its simplicity. Take not only the money, but the people themselves. Use them as labor for underground production. The demand for alcohol in the 90s was huge, and competition was minimal. 5 friends became the first victims of the new scheme. Young, healthy, able to work for many years. The ideal workforce, requiring no wages, vacations, or sick leave. Kostin equipped the bunker with a real alcohol factory, distillation apparatus, fermentation tanks, a bottling line. Everything necessary for the production of moonshine, vodka, and alcohol. Raw materials were purchased through front companies. Sugar, yeast, and raw alcohol were delivered by truck directly to the bunker. The finished product was sold through a network of underground dealers throughout the region. The profits were enormous. The cost of a liter of vodka was 15 rubles, and it was sold for 100. With a production volume of 1,000 liters per month, the net profit was 85,000. Why keep people for so long? Morozov asked. It would have been easier to hire workers officially. Shevchuk laughed nervously. Kostya was paranoid. He was afraid that someone would report him, reveal the scheme, and the prisoners couldn't go anywhere. They were guaranteed to keep quiet. But the main reason was different. Kostin derived sadistic pleasure from his power over people. The feeling of complete control, the ability to decide whether a person lived or died. Every morning, he would go down to the bunker and check the cells. He would see how his slaves were working, whether they were planning an escape, whether they were sufficiently submissive. The slightest disobedience was punished by deprivation of food or beatings. Igor Somov was his favorite victim. He was calm, hardworking, and didn't cause any trouble. Kostin would talk to him for hours, telling him about his plans for expanding the business and complaining about his negligent partners. He said, "I was his most reliable worker," Igor recalled during another interrogation. "He promised to improve the conditions and give us more food." But those were just words. In reality, conditions only got worse. With each passing year, Kostin became harsher, more suspicious, and more aggressive. The alcohol business was lucrative, but competition was intensifying. By the mid-1990s, major players had entered the market. These were organized criminal groups with serious connections and resources. Kostin understood that his small-scale operation would soon become uncompetitive. But he didn't want to give up. He had grown too accustomed to easy money, power over people, and a sense of impunity. He decided to expand his operation and look for new victims. Between 1992 and 1995, 6 more people disappeared. All according to the same pattern: bribing drivers, ambushes on the highway, and transport to the bunker. But most of the new captives could not withstand the conditions of their detention. Kostin rigorously selected the most resilient. Those who couldn't work 12 hours a day became a burden. They were simply killed and buried in the forest near the bunker. "He turned into a beast," whispered Shevchuk. In the early years, he at least retained his human appearance. But then he began to enjoy people's suffering. Investigator Morozov listened to the testimony and felt nauseous. Even in 20 years of working for the authorities, he had never encountered such cynical cruelty. Turning people into slaves for profit, keeping them in a dungeon for a quarter of a century, killing them for the slightest disobedience. At the same time, an investigation into the financial side of the crime was underway. Experts calculated the gang's approximate income over 25 years of activity. The figures were staggering. With an average profit of 100,000 rubles a month over a quarter of a century, they had accumulated 30 million. At the exchange rate of the 90s, that was about $200,000, a huge amount of money for a provincial criminal. Kostin did not spend his earnings on luxury. He lived modestly, without attracting the attention of neighbors and acquaintances. He invested the money in developing production, purchasing raw materials, and bribing officials. Part of the money went to maintain the bunker. Electricity from diesel generators, heating, ventilation, security. Plus, he paid his accomplices, Lukin and Shevchuk, 10,000 a month. But Kostin saved most of his profits. He planned to eventually shut down his business and move abroad. He wanted to buy a house in a warm country, live off the interest from his capital, and forget about the past. These plans collapsed in 2010. Law enforcement agencies stepped up their fight against illegal alcohol. Mass checks began. Producers were arrested, and equipment was confiscated. Kostin realized that the days of easy money were over. He had to shut down production, destroy evidence, and get rid of witnesses. First and foremost, the captives who knew too much. He planned to kill all those who remained alive and wall up the entrances to the bunker. He would turn the underground lair into a mass grave and disappear with his accumulated wealth. But his health failed him. In 2015, Costin suffered his first stroke. It partially paralyzed the left side of his body, his memory deteriorated, and he began to have speech problems. His accomplices realized that the leader was losing control of the situation. Lukin and Shevchuk began to think about their own safety. They discussed the possibility of eliminating witnesses and dividing the accumulated funds. A second stroke in 2016 finally took Costin out of the game. He died in the hospital, never having had the chance to carry out his plan to destroy the evidence. Lukin and Shevchuk were left alone with a huge problem. The last witness to their crimes was sitting in the bunker. Killing him meant taking responsibility for murder. Leaving him alive meant risking exposure. They chose a compromise. They took Igor to a remote forest and left him to fend for himself. They expected that an emaciated man would not survive in the wild without food or water. But Igor proved to be stronger. 26 years in prison did not break his will to live. He survived, was found, taken to hospital, and told the truth about what had happened. The trial of Lukin and Shevchuk began in August 2018. The criminal case contained 1,000 pages of materials, hundreds of pieces of evidence, and the testimony of dozens of witnesses. The prosecutor demanded the maximum punishment: kidnapping, murder, creating a criminal organization, illegal entrepreneurship. The defendants faced life imprisonment on a combination of charges. The defense attorneys attempted to mitigate their client's guilt. They argued that the deceased Costin was the main organizer and that their clients had acted under duress. They asked the court to take into account the advanced age of the defendants and their admission of guilt. However, Igor Somov became the prosecution's key witness. His testimony in court shocked everyone present. In a calm voice, he recounted 26 years of hell, the death of his friends, and the inhumane conditions of his detention. "I am not asking for pity," Igor said in his final statement, "but I am asking for justice for my friends. They did not live to see this day, to see their tormentors punished." The courtroom listened in complete silence. Many cried, unable to hide their emotions. The story of 5 friends who went to a soccer game and fell into the clutches of monsters left no one indifferent. Igor's mother, Nina Georgievna, attended every hearing. The 79-year-old woman held herself with remarkable dignity. She did not shout or demand revenge, but simply listened silently to the testimony. The parents of the other victims also came to court, those who were still alive. A quarter of a century of waiting, hope, and despair ended in that courtroom. The jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. The court found no mitigating circumstances. The crime was too heinous to warrant leniency. Gennady Lukin was sentenced to 20 years in a strict regime prison. Boris Shevchuk was sentenced to 15 years in a special regime colony. Given their age, they were not likely to be released. The verdict came into force in February 2019. Lukin and Shevchuk did not appeal. They understood that justice had prevailed and that it was pointless to argue with it. Igor Somov was granted victim status and the right to state compensation. The amount was 2 million rubles, a small sum for 26 years of life, but a symbol of recognition of his suffering. The rehabilitation process was slow. Psychiatrist Volkova worked with Igor for another 1.5 years after the trial. Gradually, his communication skills returned, as did his ability to enjoy simple things and trust people. His mother never left his side. At 80 years old, she cared for him like a child. She taught him to live again in a world that had changed beyond recognition in a quarter of a century. Igor slowly mastered modern technology. Mobile phones, the internet, bank cards. All this seemed like a miracle to a man who had spent 26 years in a stone bag. But the hardest thing was to accept the death of his friends. Igor knew they were dead. He had seen their funerals at the cemetery. But his subconscious refused to believe that what had happened was real. The psychiatrist explained this as a defensive reaction of the psyche. It was too much trauma to comprehend right away. It would take years of therapy to fully accept the loss. The families of his deceased friends warmly welcomed Igor. He became a living link to their departed sons. He told them about the last days of Andrei, Denis, Mikhail, and Oleg, and passed on their farewell words. Andrei Volkov's parents invited Igor to the cemetery. Together, they stood at their friend's grave, remembering his laughter, his dreams of football, and his plans for the future. They cried and thanked fate that at least one of the five had returned home. The case received widespread media coverage. Journalists wrote about Igor's courage, Nina Georgievna's maternal love, and the work of the investigators. The story of the five friends became a symbol of the triumph of justice over evil. Investigator Morozov received a state award for solving a crime that had remained unsolved for a quarter of a century. In an interview, he said, "This case changed my understanding of human cruelty and human resilience." Psychiatrist Volkova wrote a scientific paper on methods of rehabilitating victims of long-term imprisonment. Her experience working with Igor helped her develop new approaches to treating post-traumatic stress disorder. Driver Dubin had been dead for 13 years, but his family publicly apologized to the relatives of those who had died. His widow returned the money found in a bank safe deposit box and donated it to charity. In 2020, a memorial to the victims of the crime was erected on the site of the abandoned bunker. It is a simple stele with the names of those who died and their dates of birth and death. Andrei Volkov, Denis Krasnov, Mikhail Petrov, Oleg Zuev. They wanted to watch football. Igor comes there every year on the day of their disappearance. He brings flowers, stands in silence, and talks to his friends in his mind. He talks about how his life has changed, how football is developing, and how his mother is getting older. In 2021, on the 30th anniversary of the tragedy, a documentary book about the case was published. Igor agreed to publish his testimony, hoping that the story would help prevent similar crimes in the future. Today, Igor Somov is 50 years old. He lives with his mother in the same two-room apartment, works in a metal workshop, and is learning to use a computer. Slowly but surely, he is returning to normal life. At 84, Nina Georgievna remains a pillar of support for her son. She has the same energy, the same love, and the same belief in justice. A mother's heart that waited for a miracle and never lost hope. Sometimes Igor watches football on TV. He supports Spartak, just like he did in his youth. And every time he remembers that November day in 1991, when 5 friends went to a match and ended up in hell. But now these memories do not only bring pain. There are also bright moments. Friendship, dreams, hopes for the future. Things that even 26 years in prison could not take away. Justice prevailed. The criminals were punished. The families received answers to the questions that had tormented them. But the main victory is that evil could not completely destroy good. Igor Somov survived. He returned home. He told the truth, and in doing so, he proved that the human spirit is stronger than any chains, any prison, any cruelty. The story of 5 friends has come to an end, but their memory will live on forever.